What I'm really concerned to do is to make sure that we make the right interventions at the right time. This isn't an epidemic that's going to last for a couple of weeks. This is going to go on for months, and we need to make sure that we do the right thing at the right stage to have the biggest impact. And the measures announced yesterday, which were anybody with mild symptoms, either a fever, raised temperature or a cough, should stay at home for a week. That's not a trivial change. That's going to have a big impact of many people staying at home for a week. It's one of the things that can have the biggest impact in terms of reducing the transmissibility, the ability to actually this virus to spread quickly across the population. And there are some others that we laid out as well, potentially whole households isolating in due course. And of course, at the peak, in other words, when it's most likely that somebody could become infected because there's enough of the disease going around, to make sure that the vulnerable and elderly are really well protected during those stages. Those are pretty big changes that we've just announced. And there are others, of course, that are being looked at as well.
But you know as well as I, there's just a land border between the United Kingdom and Ireland, and there they're closing the schools. Yes. Does that not speak about a higher level of preparedness? I'm sorry to run over the same points, Sir Patrick, but does it not?
Well, I think in terms of preparedness, it's important to know we've been working on this since the beginning of January. This isn't something that suddenly has been sprung upon anybody. I think the issue of schools is one that is pretty complicated. We're not saying that we rule out closing the schools, but I just want to lay out why we've taken the decision not to do it at the moment.
Yeah.
Schools are a very important place in which transmission of flu takes place, and we know that children are a big part of transmitting flu. We don't have the same evidence at all for this disease, and we know children are very mildly affected by this disease. That's the first point. The second is, because of the nature of this disease, the way it's spread and the duration, you would have to close schools for many months, not a few weeks. And one of the questions when you start something is, how are you going to undo it? And when you undo it, if you don't get it right, it bounces back again. So schools would need to be shut for a very prolonged period.
I see.
Children, of course, aren't going to separate for a very long period. They're going to go and do other things together.
Well, so they'll probably stay with grandma in reality.
And exactly. They may also go and stay with grandma, the most vulnerable group. So I think although there's some evidence that school closure can make a difference, and it's something definitely on our plate to look at, we're going to look at it at the right time.
What would persuade you, sorry to talk over you, sir, but what would persuade you actually now is the moment, I'll talk to the Prime Minister, we need to press the button, close the schools?
Do our first three things, which we think are the biggest impact on this, monitor the effects, see where we are, get ahead of it, make sure that we've got our plans, so at the right stage, if school closures look like that's going to make a difference at that point, implement them there. So it's about monitoring the outbreak, monitoring the effects of the interventions we've made, and acting quickly on the basis of the evidence we have.
It's worth hearing. We heard the symptoms that my listeners need to be listening out for from the Prime Minister, but it's worth hearing them again from someone as high up the tree as you. Would you just go through them again for me, Sir Patrick?
They are a temperature, so raised temperature, or a cough. Those are the only two things that we're asking for in order for people to stay at home for a week. And the cough is a new cough that's constant, so not something that you've had for months and months and months, or something that you just cough once. It's a new cough which is going on, for a few hours and doesn't have to be associated with a fever. They're two separate things. Obviously, you could have both, but it's either or.
Again, speaking about differences within the United Kingdom, Scotland are going to limit public gatherings to a certain number. I believe it's 500. Again, not that yet done in England. We have, as you may or may not be aware, the St Patrick's Day parade in London this weekend, 50,000 people. How wise is that, Sir Patrick?
Just to be clear on Scotland, I think Nicola Sturgeon was clear that she completely goes with the scientific evidence that there's not much point in doing the closure of gatherings. Her point is a different one, which is about using up ambulance time if you have a gathering of over 500 people, where there's a requirement to have an ambulance present, and actually making sure that you free up the resources for the NHS. So it's a slightly different point.
Right, okay.
And a logic to that, for sure.
But we'll need a lot of cops to police St Patrick's Day parade, of course.
And of course, that's exactly right. But at the moment, we've got a relatively small number of people in the UK with coronavirus. So only when that becomes a pressure on the public services, that would be a good reason to say that therefore there are certain things that you shouldn't do. That would be a logical reason to do it. And mass gatherings, as I've tried to explain previously, they are a place, of course, where you might get transmission, but you are more likely in these diseases to get transmission from small gatherings of people close together. You're most likely actually to catch this from a friend or a family member or something.
Or a work colleague or something.
Or a work colleague close together.
I see. When you say you and your colleagues have been working at this since January, I'm just trying to get a glimmer of good news. So you and your colleagues have been out for, nearly 2.5 months. Is it as bad as you feared? Is it not quite as grave? Is it worse than you feared? How would you characterise it?
I think the predicted mortality rate has come down since we first started looking at it. I think that the evidence from Wuhan is they've got effectively on top of this. I think that it's less bad than it looked in January, but there's no doubt this is a very serious problem. It's going to go, and it has gone right the way across the world. It's very easily transmitted, and it does have a mortality rate which is considerably higher than seasonal flu.
So just picking up on what the Prime Minister said, Britain has seen dark times. We will get through this. Is there finally a positive note? You say that it's perhaps not as grave as you and your colleagues were modelling it.
Not at the very beginning. I think we should take this very seriously.
Oh, I'm not suggesting otherwise. I assure you.
But I think it's not as bad as we initially thought right at the beginning of January, where the mortality rate was predicted to be considerably higher.
Yeah, and lastly, can a country self-isolate? Italy are attempting it. Surely it's impossible.
It's impossible. I think it's not and also when you've got it inside the country, it's incredibly difficult to stop that spread.